Good morning and welcome to our webinar on GDPR Assist for Dynamics GP. My name is Rachel Herr, I'm the Marketing Executive for m-hance and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. I'm joined by my colleague Gerard Dayman, who is m-hance's Product Director Dynamics. Before I hand it over to Gerard, I would like to review a few simple housekeeping items. We expect the webinar to last approximately half an hour. Please note the webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand. All participants are set to listen only and will remain so for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions, click the question button on the right hand side of your screen. In the new panel that opens, type your question at the top box and click ask. Feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. Due to time constraints, we will answer them offline after the webinar. With that, I would like to hand you over to our presenter, Jer.
Hello everybody. Welcome to this relatively short webinar covering our GDPR Assist product for Dynamics GP. For those of you who caught our GDPR Assist presentation at our recent customer event in London, some of this content will look very familiar. However, we've expanded a couple of areas and in addition, at the end, we'll show a little product. For those who aren't familiar with the content, it's worth me pointing out at the onset that the intention of this presentation is to outline our solution for managing personal data within GP, not to cover GDPR as a whole. So you'll hear no mention of data controllers or data processors. So with that, let's get going. The background to this presentation is, of course, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, but specifically we aim to outline the difficulties that the GDPR might create for organizations using GP. By way of a solution to these problems, we present a new product called GDPR Assist. As I say, the background to GDPR Assist is, of course, the General Data Protection Regulation itself. Whilst the GDPR will have many aspects, the key point for us is its requirement that personal data should not be held onto for longer than is necessary. How long is that? Well, that depends on what your individual circumstances are. But what is personal data? Name, address, phone number, bank details. Essentially, personal data is defined as anything that can allow a living person to be identified. Will Brexit provide organisations in the UK with the get out of jail free card? In a word, no. There's two reasons for this. The first is the fact that much of the requirement of GDPR is independently covered by the UK's most recent Data Protection Act. In addition, the GDPR has an extraterritorial requirement, meaning that when organisations outside of the EU retain personal information relating to EU citizens, for example, if they sell into the EU, then they too are subject to the GDPR. The essential point here is that if you store personal data, that you don't store it indefinitely, but rather get rid of it at an appropriate time. So what potential difficulties will the personal data requirements of the GDPR create for users, specifically of GP? What are the key considerations? The first consideration is whether or not any of your Dynamics GP companies actually contain personal data. If not, then you should be in the clear. But if so, then GDPR will likely be relevant. The second consideration is locating the data. This isn't always as simple as it might seem, as it can be spread over many tables within the GP database. And if you have multiple companies, then you have multiple databases. Even if you can locate the data, there is then the question of how to remove or cleanse it. This can be a challenge for a number of reasons. I'll explore each of these points in turn in the following slides. You yourselves are, of course, the best people to know whether or not you store personal data in GP. But by way of illustration, we've encountered quite a variety of examples, including companies who sell B2C, who keep customer details in GP, companies that engage with sole traders, recording them as suppliers, NFPs that record volunteers as suppliers in order to pay expenses, or who record donors as debtors, any organisation that records membership details in GP or runs B2C direct debit processing from GP. All of those organisations will have personal data in GP. Where is the bulk of this personal data held? You can see from previous examples that personal information can relate to either creditors or debtors. But in GP, such information can be spread across a number of tables in the database. For example, the address details will be stored separately from the banking details. Whereas most of this information is accessible using the relevant vendor or customer ID, this isn't always the case. In GP, the Internet Information Table, which is used to hold information such as email addresses, is shared across both vendors and customers, and so requires a slightly more complicated method of access. In addition, personal data could be stored in additional tables, perhaps tables introduced by third-party add-on products, or perhaps by bespoke editions made specifically for you. This adds even greater complexity. So how can you remove such data? The simple answer is not easily. As outlined previously, personal data can be stored on numerous core tables across both creditor and debtor functions. In addition, you potentially have to allow for third-party or bespoke tables. Given the potential number of records involved, it may not be feasible to update or remove such data manually. The GP schema can be quite complex, and the risk of damage or knock-on effects following a badly implemented data update can be significant. Moreover, virtually as soon as you update the data, it needs reviewing again, as data is constantly aging and is potentially being stored for too long. And all of this is required across potentially numerous GP company databases. So a DIY approach to ensuring your personal data is maintained in line with your GDPR strategy is challenging, ongoing, and fraught with risk. There must be an easier way, and yes, there is. Introducing GDPR Assist for Dynamics GP. This product doesn't promise to make you GDPR compliant. Only you yourselves can determine what it takes for your organization to be GDPR compliant. However, if you store personal data in GP, then part of your GDPR strategy will be to account for that data, and GDPR Assist facilitates that. So now, having outlined the problem, I want to look at the solution. I'll do this by digging a little deeper into some of the considerations that this product needs to take into account, and in each case outlining how the product will address the issue. I'll then finish up with a very quick look at some of the key screens that are used to undertake such functionality. Let me start by fleshing out what we mean by personal data. There are two key aspects to this. Let's start by looking at the sample data on screen. You'll see 5 records with 7 columns, but which of this data is relevant to GDPR Assist? As GDPR only concerns itself with personal records, i.e. those of individuals, not companies, only the 2 records highlighted in blue would be deemed relevant. How will GDPR Assist know the difference? As part of the product setup, you can define fields on the vendor and creditor master records, which can be used to specify which records are personal. GDPR Assist checks these values so that corporate records can be ignored. By way of example, this snippet from the main product setup page shows how we have specified the UPS zone field on the creditor master as the field that will be used to identify which creditor records relate to individuals rather than companies. Here we are specifying that if the value in the UPS zone field begins with P, then the record is personal. Likewise, the product also supports the definition of a field to indicate that the record is protected from processing. In this case, any record for which user-defined field 2 contains a value beginning with K will be ignored by the process. In subsequent slides, we will see how the product allows you to define the criteria for identifying which record should be processed for GDPR. Typically, this would involve processing records for which there hadn't been any transactional activity for a set period. But what about cases of a customer who might be about to re-engage with you, or a vendor with whom you're about to place an order? These fields provide a way of ensuring that such records will not be processed at this time, essentially a stay of execution. You can, of course, select any fields and values that you like to define the individual and protected records. Likewise, the product only concerns itself with fields that store personal information. So for example, the vendor ID, currency, and vendor class fields are not relevant to us. However, name, address, phone number, and tax ID would be. As such, only the data in orange is of concern to us from a GDPR perspective, i.e. the personal data fields for non-corporate records. In addition to allowing you to define personal records, GDPR Assist also allows you to define which columns contain personal data. GDPR Assist allows you to specify the individual fields that contain personal data so that only those fields are processed by the product. For the core creditor and debtor tables, such as PM00200, the vendor master, the product comes pre-equipped with a list of fields most likely to contain personal data. You have the option to specify new fields for each such table. You also have the ability to specify new tables and new fields for those tables. So how do we know which records? and which fields on those records are applicable for GDPR. But when to process such records? When is a record ripe for GDPR? Out of the box, GDPR Assist comes equipped with a set of default selection criteria for both vendor and customer related records. Here we can see the default set of criteria for creditors. Essentially any individual, i.e. non-corporate creditors, that haven't had any transactions in a specified period and who are older than that period, so that new creditors aren't picked up prior to recording transactions, fall into the GDPR net. Note that protected records are excluded. An equivalent set of criteria is provided for debtors. In each case, you have the ability to modify such criteria. Whilst this can be done via the product itself, it does require a knowledge of both SQL and the GP schema. As such, our recommendation would be that this is done in consultation with m-hance. To ensure that any such changes to the criteria do not adversely affect the next iteration of the GDPR process, preview functionality is provided so that you can see the effects of the change, i.e. you can see which records would be picked up and processed the next time the job runs. So, once we've identified the records and fields that require data to be discarded, how do we discard the data contained within them? Quite simply, we anonymize it. We simply blank the fields that contain the personal data. Anonymization of data fulfills the requirement for the discarding of data under GDPR. Anonymization has another key benefit. The rest of the record remains intact, and so does any transaction history. So you can still see the transactions for customer 123, and that data can still be part of any analysis or aggregations that you have. You just don't know who customer 123 actually is. So now we know what the product does and how it does it. But when does it do this? Well, no manual intervention is required. This wouldn't be practical, as the evaluation and processing of such data will be an ongoing task into the future. As such, the actual processing of the records is an automated background task. No intervention is required. The process defaults to running weekly, but again, this is completely configurable by you. For a standard GP installation, i.e. no bespoke fields, no third-party add-ons that contain personal data relating to suppliers or customers, that should pretty much be it. Simply install, configure, and let it run. And the configuration should be fairly minimal. This is because the product comes pre-equipped with a default set of fields for the core GP supplier and customer tables. For more customized scenarios, the application supports the specification of new tables and fields so that third-party add-ons and bespoke tables can be accommodated. Even tables that have been added to the database but not to the GP dictionary can also be incorporated. Some additional features of GDPR Assist. The product caters for scanned images, for example invoices, that are attached to records. It also comes equipped with a set of restricted fields for each of the core vendor and debtor tables, so that you cannot inadvertently select fields for anonymization that would compromise the integrity of the GP database. The product can be deployed against any number of your GP company databases so that all of your GP data can be processed. The configuration of the product is defined at company level so that it can support different tables, fields, evaluation criteria, retention windows, etc. in each company. However, in many cases, the same configuration will apply to many or even all of your companies. For this reason, the product provides the ability to copy the configuration from any given company to one or more companies. All anonymizations are logged. They're logged within GP without obviously recording any personal information, and such details are then accessible via a smart list. The product is offered for all versions of GP from GP 2010 and up. Now, I've covered the slides. Before we finish up, let's have a very quick peek at the product itself. As the main processing of records runs in the background, the only screens required for the product are those to install and configure it. So these screens may look a little complex or cumbersome, but please bear in mind that they are intended for very infrequent use and only then by a designated user, or in some cases just by m-hance. So let me just switch over to these screens. Now, this is the main configuration or setup screen within GDPR Assist. The first thing to notice is the selection of system up here, where we can select creditor or debtor, because as you can see, separate configurations are supported for each. The idea being that we track the configurations for debtor or creditor, and then we anonymize data related to a given debtor or a given creditor on the tables that are linked in. In addition, you can also see that all configuration values are stored on a per company basis. So we have a full set of configurations for each company, and of course different configurations for debtors and creditors. At the top of the screen, you can once again see the area to specify fields to determine individual, i.e. non-corporate and protected records. On the left-hand side, you can see a cut-off months field. This is where we specify the inactivity window. So for example, when I said earlier that supplier or customer records would be anonymized after a certain period of inactivity, this field defines that. So in this case, we're looking at records that are 60 months old, so 5 years old. If they're younger than 5 years, they won't be anonymized. Note also that the minimum months field at the top of the screen, this is a read-only field. It's a safety net to ensure that a user cannot inadvertently set the cutoff value too low. It is possible to change this value, but not through the UI. The idea being if you try and set the cutoff months below 24, that you can't actually do it. So it stops you inadvertently anonymizing data in too short of a period. Notice also to the right the specification of an anonymized field and value. In this case, we're using vendor check number. When a record is anonymized, this field is updated with the specified value, both as a record of the anonymization itself and also to enhance the efficiency of the application, which can then ignore previously anonymized records. The middle section of the screen lists the tables that will be evaluated by the process. As I said, core tables will be specified by default, so you can see them here. The vendor master, vendor address, the EFT bank table, notes table, the internet table. And if we went back to debtor, you'd see a different set of tables, obviously. But as I mentioned earlier, you can also add your own table. So here we've added one from our mbank module, m-hance 06000, because it contains fields that will be irrelevant. For each table, you can click to see the fields that are relevant. So these are the fields containing personal data on our mbank table, or the ones potentially containing personal data. So you have address fields there and you have bank details, etc. Fields can easily be added or removed. You can delete a row, you can add them simply at the bottom. So if for the core tables, we will give you a set of what we feel the fields could contain personal data, but if you've added a user or a particular value into a user defined field, or you have an extra field on a table, maybe through a bespoke customization, you can just add it into that list and it will automatically be incorporated into the process. For every given table here, you can see that we have a list of restricted fields. These are the ones that we don't want you to anonymize, so validation is inbuilt to stop you doing that by mistake. New tables, actually, if just go back here, new tables can also be added via a lookup. So if we wanted to add new tables, we have options here, and you can narrow down the searches in different ways. Essentially, select the table that you want and bring it back, add it to the list. Actually, I should have shown that you've got a similar lookup for fields. So if you wanted to do, you can do a field lookup, and that shows you all the fields on this particular table. So even though it's quite technical, it's not that technical. You don't have to, you don't have to write SQL to do any of this, with the exception of the evaluation criteria. Most of it is simply point and click. If I clicked in here, you'd be able to see the SQL criteria. That's the screenshot we showed earlier on. So again, if I was to right click on that, you can insert rows, delete rows. The idea being that if you want to add another criteria, another where clause, for example, you can add a new row, put in the where clause there, and you can validate the selections using the preview button that I mentioned earlier. One of the key requirements of the product is to be able to define joins between the tables, so that way it mimics the structure of the database. For example, if I was to click on the address table here, you'll see that the join between the master and the address is simply on vendor ID. It's a single join. However, the product supports much more complex joins than that. So if I click on the M-bank table, you'll see that a much more complicated connection is required, comprising both dynamic values and a literal constant here. So this is messy looking, but this is what provides the power of the application really. So you can define creditors or debtors as being individuals rather than corporate, so then they're applicable for GDPR. And then you can define any field on any table that's related to those creditors or debtors as being potentially containing personal data, and the process will automatically pick them up and anonymize those when they meet the criteria. So that's pretty much it. There's very little to actually show because it's just the configuration. So I'll just pop back here for a minute back here, and I'll just carry on with. So that's pretty much it. Brings us to the conclusion of the webinar. Probably went much quicker than usual. In summary, just to reiterate that if you have data in any of your Dynamics GP companies that will be subject to GDPR, then you could benefit from GDPR Assist. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend today's webinar. I've obviously gone quicker than expected, so hopefully that's not unfortunate. Please do feel free to get in touch with us with any questions or feedback you may have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jay. So that concludes today's session. I would like to thank you all for joining us. For those who have submitted a question, we will respond to you directly offline. Please also keep a lookout in your inboxes over the next few days, where we will send you a link to today's recording. Once the webinar has closed, a short survey will pop up. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to complete it. Once again, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.